Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday, the 4th of August. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 162 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The UN is conducting a fact-finding mission in response to requests from both Russia and Ukraine after 53 Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in an explosion at a barracks in the pro-Russian militia-controlled Olenivka. Ukraine claims it was an operation plotted in advance by the Kremlin and carried out by Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group. Russia claims that the Ukrainian military was responsible. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants to talk directly to China's leader Xi Jinping in the hope that China can use its influence with Russia to bring the war to an end. So far, China has refused to condemn Russia's invasion, and Xi Jinping told Putin it would support Russia's sovereignty and security. The US Senate has ratified Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO, voting 95-1 in support. The US is the 23rd member state to ratify what would be the most significant expansion of the 30-member alliance since the 1990s, as it responds to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All 30 NATO members must ratify the accession before Finland and Sweden can become members. The former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder has come under fire for a private meeting held with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin after he travelled on holiday to Moscow to meet him. Schröder told German media in a lengthy interview he had nothing to apologise for over his friendship with Putin, whom he met last week during a visit to the Russian capital. And as we came on air, a Moscow court has just convicted the US basketball player Brittany Griner on drug charges, sentencing her to 9 years in prison and a 1 million ruble fine in a politically charged verdict that could lead to a prisoner swap with the US. Her arrest took place days before Russia invaded Ukraine, prompting frantic backdoor negotiations between the US and Russian intelligence services as her trial played out in a small courthouse just outside the Moscow city limits. Now, I'm delighted that we are joined this evening by Paul McLennan MSP. Paul has been the MSP for East Lothian since 2021. Previously, he served as a local councillor for the Dunbar and East Linton multi-member ward on East Lothian Council since 2007, and was both the SNP group leader and the council leader from 2007 to 2012. He's also been a board member of NHS Lothian, regional offices of Scottish Enterprise, and the Commission on School Reform. Paul, good evening. How are you keeping?
Not bad, Andrew. Just back from holiday, so just trying to get back into the work. I suppose work mind again. So yeah, not bad.
Easing back into it. Well, thank you for finishing your holiday and coming to join us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Our first story this evening is that the Bank of England has pushed interest rates up by 0.5 percentage points in response to a spike in inflation that it said will hit 13% in October, despite predicting a prolonged recession. In the worst outlook for the economy since the 2008 banking crash, the central bank said that the UK would enter recession in the final quarter of this year, but it raised interest rates to 1.75% in an attempt to tackle soaring inflation. It was the biggest jump in borrowing costs in 27 years. Bank officials said a rise in the energy price cap to an expected £3,500 in October would be the main reason for the jump in inflation to 13%, its highest since 1980. Although the continuing supply chain disruption hitting global trade was another major factor in pushing up prices. The longest recession since 2008 would begin by the end of this year, it added, with the economy contracting throughout 2023. The prolonged downturn is expected to push the unemployment rate from 3.8% to 5.5% by 2024 and will feature a record fall in living standards next year. 8 of the bank's 9-strong Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, voted for the 0.5 percentage point rise in interest rates, leaving the former LSE economist Silvana Tenreiro the only member to support a smaller 0.25% increase. The MPC said inflationary pressures in the UK and the rest of Europe had intensified significantly since the bank's last review in May, largely reflecting a near doubling in wholesale gas prices since May, owing to Russia's restriction of gas supplies to Europe and the risk of further cut curbs. Households have seen their energy bills triple in a year after the price cap. Households will have seen their energy bills triple in a year after the price cap is increased again in October. Ofgem will announce the cap at the end of this month, and there has been speculation that it will rise above £3,000 before increasing to £3,600 in January. However, the Bank of England said it expected wholesale gas prices to rise more quickly, forcing Ofgem to push the cap to £3,500 as soon as October. So, Paul, 8 of the MPC's 9 members voted to raise interest rates by half a percentage point, and that's the biggest increase in 27 years. Is it not about time that this discredited neoliberal economics was stopped? How does raising the cost of living during a cost of living crisis help? You can't starve people out of poverty, and we know that Liz Truss has now started quoting the Thatcher poster boy, the economist Patrick Minford.
Yeah, I think it's deeply worrying, Andrew. I think we're already seeing an uplift in cases for people having to deal with I suppose, the current rise in energy costs. I think this is just going to add to it, and I think as we know, there's around about 1 in 5 people who are on variable mortgage rates at the moment, which again will impact on them almost within the next 4 to 6 weeks. But it's also stirring up problems for those who are on fixed rate mortgages, because these will come to an end within a certain period of time, and again, this is just stirring up a problem. So, 0.5% rise is a significant rise. As you said, it's the largest in 27 years, and it is just going to impact further on those who are really struggling, and it's going to push more people into poverty, and it will be a choice between heating and eating. So it's deeply worrying. I think it had been very much touted by the Bank of England and officials that this was going to happen. Nevertheless, it's a deeply worrying situation, and I don't think it's going to stop at 1.75%.
Absolutely, Paul. Now, the FT was commenting today that the UK is facing a much bleaker economic outlook than either the US or the Eurozone, because households here are both more exposed to the energy price shock than in the US, and are less protected by government measures than people living in the Eurozone. So I wonder, is that part of the problem here? The Brexit-wedded, Brexit-laden Westminster doesn't know what it wants, what it is, or what it wants to be.
Yeah, I think when you look at actions taken by other governments compared with what we see, for example, EDF in France was nationalised in terms of that. In terms of looking at what could be done, the UK government has powers over Ofgem in terms of asking them to look at what they could do to look at to negate the costs, rising costs, and I think that's part of the problem. In terms of that, it's a political choice, and the UK government, have at the moment have chosen not to to look discuss with Ofgem and what they can do to try and negate this. £300 a month for people, for costs for energy, it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. And I said we are now seeing people who are choosing to heat or eat. And one of the key things now, we were talking today to our local food bank. We've got a meeting coming up now talking around about warm banks. So this is where we're going to have to look at places during the winter that can provide heat that people can go to. Warm banks. It's almost going back 150 years that we're having to discuss about warm banks where people go just to get a heat in the winter time. That's the state of where we are just now. That's the current state. And when we look at it, let's look at what energy we've got in Scotland at the moment. We have no powers over energy policy whatsoever. We should be one of the best placed countries in the world to deal with this, because we're so energy rich. At the moment, we have no powers over it at all.
Yep, and we're paying for it. But your point about heat banks is right. I saw earlier this week the University of Edinburgh announced that the main library in George Square will be open to anybody from October, and it's intended to be used as a heat bank for that purpose. Yeah. But there was one other thing in the Bank of England forecast today that I wanted to talk to you about quickly. The forecast showed that households' post-tax income will fall in real terms through 2022 and 2023. And that's even after factoring in the small amount of financial support the UK government announced in May. So that's a peak to trough decline of more than 5% in household incomes, and that's going to be the worst on record. The data goes back to the 1960s. So families, after a dozen years of damaging Tory austerity, are now facing the most significant decline in their incomes since the 1960s. Do you think are families going to be able to cope with this latest beating?
No, and again, I think there's more drastic action required. At the moment, what's been proposed isn't going to be enough. We are seeing that at the moment in terms of that people, quite frankly, their expenditures more than their income. It's not around about cutting costs. It's not around about having to deal with, previously looked at debt advice around about credit cards and so on. This is purely down now to people have more expenditure than income. That is due to energy costs going up, mortgage costs going up, food costs going up. So I really think we're at the tip of the iceberg at the moment about what it's going to impact. I think we're really going to see major issues this winter that we've never seen before, and we need to be doing a lot more than what we're doing at the moment. As I said, we're talking about heat banks, warm banks, food banks, and so on. Month on month in the last year or so, our increases for our local food bank has been around about 80% a month. 80% a month. And these are people who are working, and predominantly these are working families. Vast majority are working families. So I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we do here. And I think, as you said, inflation's meant to be looking for another year or so and before it comes down. In terms of the recession, we're talking about another year or so before it comes down. So, we're facing at least another 18 months of this, at least another 18 months of this. So more needs to be done.
So it's a pretty bleak prospect, and absolutely, Paul. Let's look at the energy price a little bit more, though, because Ofgem has confirmed that the energy price cap will now be updated quarterly rather than every 6 months, as it warned that customers face a very challenging winter ahead. The energy regulator said reviewing the price cap for household bills every 3 months would allow it to adjust much more quickly to volatility in the market. Energy prices surged last year as the global economy recovered from COVID-19 lockdowns. The invasion of Ukraine in late February then prompted a further jump in prices as Western allies sought to economically isolate Russia, the major gas and oil supplier. The knock-on effects of the energy price rises have been felt across the world, and in the UK it exposed a price cap system that was, quote, not fit for purpose for the kind of market we have today, according to Jonathan Brearley, the chief executive of Ofgem. The regulator raised the cap on the average dual fuel tariff by 54% to £1,971 from April, the biggest increase since the cap was introduced in 2019. Consumers have been warned that they face another big hike to just under £3,500 when the next cap, which will come into effect in October, is announced later this month. So, Paul, Jonathan Brearley, the chief executive of Ofgem, says that the price cap system is not fit for purpose for the kind of market we have today. I wondered, is it not rather more fundamental than that? It's about the market that we have today, relying on market forces almost entirely in order to run a market on which ultimately people's lives depend. That's almost Dickensian in its brutality.
Yeah, it is market based, and the UK government have powers to change that market, as have other European countries. Have been looking to do that. When you see that, for example, the price cap increases in France, which were around about 48%, and we're talking 54% in the UK. So that's one government taking some action, and another government choosing not to. It's driven by Tory ideology. Let the market decide. Well, the market's going to end up killing people this winter, pure and simple. And the key thing in the last few days, we have seen energy providers come out and announce their profits, record profits, billions of pounds in the first quarter. That's wrong. That's the market. That's the failure of the market at the moment, is that we're seeing record numbers of increases. We're seeing record numbers of people going into fuel poverty. And yet we are seeing the energy companies with record profits. There is something fundamentally wrong with that. And the UK government should be doing a lot more on that just now, and having the power to go in and change the markets. Literally, this will be saving people's lives. Literally, will be saving people's lives. People will die because of this system that's in place at the moment. Let's not beat about the bush. People will die. And because of government policy, because of energy companies making the excess profits, people will die this winter, and it's heartbreaking.
It's a very good point that you make, Paul. The Martin Lewis, the financial commentator, has been making that point now for several weeks, and I think it may now be starting to begin to dawn on people. But you mentioned there the Tory approach to these things, and it certainly has struck me, as you say, with the spectacular increase in the rate of profitability of oil majors and energy companies, that it's maybe unlikely that there'll be any intervention in the market, because the situation here is doing what Tories want, which is transferring money from families to shareholders.
Yeah, and I think that's the case, and I think when we had the I suppose the I suppose the when we looked at it before, the discussion for taxing energy companies on excess profits and so on, one of the key things that the Tories said is it would stop these businesses investing. That's not the case. It's proved not to be the case in other countries. And it wouldn't be the case here. And as I said, when you look at the record profits of these companies, there's something fundamentally wrong in terms of that. And I think the future projections, even with the tax that was brought in, isn't going to isn't going to change their profits by a vast amounts of money. So the Tories' argument for not doing more is almost been proven not. It has been proven not to be having a detrimental effect on the companies. If anything, the exact opposite. So there's a lot more needing to be done. These companies can't continue to make billions upon billions upon billions of pounds. They're the most profitable companies in the UK, in Europe, in the world, and we're now seeing the highest cost of living crisis that we've ever seen, and an impact on people that's never been seen before. And yet we have a Tory government sitting on its hands saying, let the market decide. And that can't be the case. We can't be. And for us up in Scotland, we're energy rich, and yet here we are in this position. It's fundamentally wrong. The UK government needs to be doing more. And if we're talking about discussions around about independence and so on, this for me is one of the biggest arguments for independence. We get to decide our own discussion, our own arguments, our own policy on energy. We wouldn't be in this position. If we were an independent country, we wouldn't be in this position.
Thanks, Paul. You make a point very well there. Now, let's tie the Bank of England story to UK politics now, because Liz Truss would review whether the Bank of England's mandate is fit for purpose, a cabinet backer has said, suggesting she would examine its exclusionary independence on interest rates as the bank prepares for more crunch decisions on interest rates. The UK Attorney General, Suella Braverman, told Sky News the Tory leadership frontrunner would look again at the bank's powers. Interest rates should have been raised a long time ago, and the Bank of England has been too slow in this regard, Braverman said. She added, Liz Truss has made clear that she wants to review the mandate that the Bank of England has, so that's going to be looking in detail at exactly what the Bank of England does and see whether it's actually fit for purpose in terms of its entire exclusionary independence over interest rates. It came hours before the bank raised interest rates by 0.5 percentage point. That's the biggest increase since 1995. And also in connection with Liz Truss, just as we came on air, it's being reported that she has been reported to the Standards Commissioner by the Lib Dems for failing to declare a Fizz with Liz dinner for Conservative MPs, which was held in her honour at a Mayfair members club and funded by a Conservative donor. The donor, Robin Burley, it happens, who has an ancestor, Hugh Burley, who led the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry when they killed 15 people at the massacre at Peterloo in 1819. However, Paul, firstly, with regard to this latest Truss policy announcement, do you think, is this announcement going to stick or twist like the regional pay board's announcement, which lasted only a few hours? After all, it was briefed to the press by Suella Braverman this morning.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was on this programme the last time, we talked about Boris Johnson and his lack in depth, his lack of knowledge in terms of policy making and so on. I didn't think I'd be on here saying about another Tory politician with even less depth and a complete lack of knowledge in lots of policy areas. We've seen that in our foreign being the Foreign Office Minister and so on. So I think, we've already seen her backtracking on a few issues. I think, again, she'll regret this. I think the Bank of England mandate was brought in to give them that independence, to stop the political interference. I have no faith in Liz Truss or any other UK, whether it's a Labour or a Tory, whatever decide Prime Minister at this stage, making these policy decisions. They should be independent. Of course, there'll be discussions goes on with the Bank of England and the government, but it should be an independent choice. The Bank of England mandate at the moment is to keep inflation below 2%. Now, we can argue whether that should have been quicker rises in interest rates or not, but for me, there needs to be that independence, and I hope, when Scotland becomes independent, that a central bank will have that independence to look at that as well. I think that's important. We have the commission at the moment that looks at the fiscal commission, looks at I suppose our policies in terms of what the government does, but we need the central bank needs independence. It can't have that political interference. That's just a recipe for disaster in that. But Liz Truss has no depth and a complete lack of knowledge right across the board. So I would be seriously concerned if she changes that mandate.
Well, you make a good point, Paul, about the politics of this. So we'll speak hypothetically here. If she becomes Prime Minister and if she goes ahead and removes the independence of the Bank of England, as Suella Braverman has suggested this morning, now, in the context of whoever becomes Liz Truss's Chancellor of the Exchequer, and yesterday I saw bookies suggesting it was going to be Kwasi Kwarteng, do you think, is he going to relish the poisoned chalice of being the minister who puts up interest rates and hurts voters even more? As you just said, the UK Finance say about 1 in 5 households in the UK are on variable rate mortgages. So is the new Chancellor, who is going to exercise a reclaimed power to put up interest rates, automatically going to be hated in 1 in 5 households in the country?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that, but I think I remember, and this goes back a number of years to the late 80s, and I think this is when my wife and I first bought our house. I remember interest rates going up 4 times in one day. By I think it was Nigel Lawson at the time, and these were political decisions that were made, and interest rate decisions might be made, near an election time that doesn't support the economic cycle at that time. And so, yeah, I think it is a poison chalice in terms of that. But the concern I would have is that the decisions that have been made aren't for the monetary policy or fiscal policy. They're purely for be made on political interests, and that would be my real concern. Leave it to the people who have the expertise in that. Now, we can agree or disagree on what level of expertise there is within the Bank of England. However, it should be left to the people who know and of course there will be discussions going on between government and the Bank of England, because obviously monetary policy and fiscal policy are inextricably linked. So there needs to be that discussion. However, interest rate decisions need to be made by a central bank, and it needs to be made independently.
No, you make a couple of good points there, Paul. According to Liz Truss's former colleague David Gauck, who's now out of government, she point blank refuses to accept advice or guidance from experts. It's one of the things she does in a very Brexiteer kind of style. And I was just wondering, is this a symptom that she's going to do the same with the Bank of England? And is it also a symptom that she either doesn't know or has completely forgotten the point you were making, the chaos of the major years when the Tory government still had the power to move interest rates? As you say, Nigel Lawson increasing the rate 4 times in a day, and I remember as the UK dropped out of the European monetary system, and I was in the course of trying to buy my first flat. At one point during that day, interest rates were at 125% for about 10 minutes. So is Liz Truss determined to cover her ears and ignore the history of the lessons of history and press on with this for dogmatic reasons?
One, I think for dogmatic reasons, and I think it's also indicative of the Tory government, whether it's under Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak and so on. There seems to be a we know better kind of attitude. We're not going to listen to experts. We'll make the choice. Now, of course, any politician has that opportunity to listen to what civil servants or experts are saying and then make that political choice. Now, that's politics. You live and die by your decisions you make. However, what we're seeing now in almost any case that's there we're seeing politicians making the Tory government making choices, ignoring near enough all the time what they've been told. They were told Brexit would be a disaster, and look what happened. In terms of that, they were told, for example, around about the Rwanda policy. Priti Patel was told around about that, and it'll proven to be a disaster. So it's indicative of this Tory government. It seems to be we know better, and it's almost a Trump-like approach to government. We know better in terms of that, and that's going to continue. And I know we'll be touching it later on, but it's almost the Tory government's approach to the devolved administrations as well. It just, we know better, and that, it's a recipe for disaster. And we've seen how, and again, it comes back to the lack of in-depth knowledge from Boris Johnson and the rest of his cabinet, which is, it's frightening. Actually, it's really frightening.
Thanks, Paul. Well, you link very nicely and very tidily to our next story, because the former Conservative Party leader Ian Duncan Smith, who it's suggested would be Liz Truss's chief whip, has proposed that SNP MPs should face questioning in the House of Commons so that the UK government can make SNP MPs accountable for the policies of the Scottish government. Duncan Smith's idea turns on its head the principle that opposition parties in Westminster hold the UK government to account and would in effect make the Scottish government ministers subordinate and answerable to SNP MPs at Westminster. Responding to his comments, the SNP Deputy Westminster leader Kirsten Oswald MP said, "This is an utterly ridiculous suggestion, showing that even the Tories are out of ideas for how to fix the broken Westminster system. It's not the SNP's job to explain why Westminster control is increasingly making life more difficult for the people of Scotland, even if the Tories are out of excuses. The job of SNP MPs in Westminster is to stand up for Scotland against a UK government choosing to ignore our interests at every turn. That is what they will continue to do for as long as we suffer under Westminster control, which I strongly believe won't be for very much longer." So, firstly, Paul, this idea was suggested in the course of the meeting by James Bundy, who's a Tory councillor from Falkirk North. Now, Mr. Bundy a few days ago was telling us that Kemi Badenoch has the intellectual philosophy and the personal integrity we need as a party and as a country, when he was commenting on the Tory car crash of the Titans leadership election. Now, it seems that no one in the Tory party listens to Mr. Bundy, so should Ian Duncan Smith, or so should we listen to James Bundy?
This is incredible. It's incredible arrogance in terms of that, and I think we've mentioned on the programme before is many times Scottish Parliament committees have asked for UK government ministers to come up and explain why they've made decisions and how that's impacted on Scotland. Very rarely do they come up here. Very rarely do they even come back to any questions that are raised. And sometimes we've seen 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 letters being ignored asking for evidence to be given. So there's a complete utter arrogance around about it. There's a complete utter, I think it highlights their disgust at the devolved administrations. I think most Tories have had the chance would abolish the devolved administrations, and I genuinely mean that now. And I think that's what they would like to move towards. So it's a complete misunderstanding of the system, a devolved system, being Duncan Smith, but it's an incredible arrogance. And the comments made about the First Minister and the First Minister of Wales are indicative of that. And the SNP MPs and opposition MPs are there to hold the UK government to account, not for UK government to hold a devolved administrations to account, not in the devolved administrations parliament, but in a UK parliament. It's complete arrogance, and it's ignorance, I think, of the devolved system, and it shows their complete, as I said, disgust of the devolved administration still being there. I think they would do away with them if they had the chance.
Thanks, Paul. And we'll touch on the behaviour of Westminster ministers and their refusal to speak to committees at Holyrood. And of course, as we now know, the refusal to speak to committees at Westminster as well. We'll talk about that as part of our next story, because the SNP has accused Anas Sarwar of hypocrisy over his key principles set out in his paper, Stronger Holyrood, which the SNP claims are undermined by his denial of the democratic mandate for an independence referendum. Following the publication of a paper on strengthening democracy in Scotland, Scottish Labour outlined their key principles for the Scottish Parliament. It begins with the first statement that the Scottish people are sovereign and have the right to determine the best form of government suited to our needs. That's the principle at the core of the Scottish claim of right. The SNP has said that the Scottish Government has a greater mandate for a referendum than the one achieved in 2011. However, Scottish Labour has said that they would vote against the bill for an independence referendum proposed by the Scottish Government. The SNP accuses Scottish Labour of still standing shoulder to shoulder with the Tories and trying to block the democratic will of the people. Now, Paul, earlier today you said Scottish Labour's so-called key principles are a con trick, and Anas Sarwar should apologise for trying to hoodwink people with his hypocrisy. If Labour had a shred of honesty or integrity, their top pledge, that the Scottish people are sovereign and have the right to determine the best form of government suited to our needs, would mean that they support the democratic mandate for an independence referendum, a mandate that's greater than the one achieved in 2011 and which they accepted. So, Paul, is there anything else that you'd like to say about Mr. Sarwar and the document that he and the British Labour Party in Scotland have published today?
It's incredible duplicity. It really is, in terms of, claiming that Scotland's the right of people, Scotland are sovereign is incredible. The people of Scotland in 2021 made the choice to elect a pro-independence majority parliament, the highest pro-independence majority parliament that was there. One of the highest ever election results, near enough 48% of the electorate. No other governing party in Europe achieves that percent. So so there's the sovereign right of the Scottish people to do that. And so if he's talking about respecting that, respect 2021 and the result that came out of that's incredible. And we have the position that the Mark Drakeford, the Labour First Minister in Wales, had said he would support a referendum if that was the case, and the SNP should have that. So we've got the ridiculous position that the Labour leader in Wales respects the mandate that the Scottish people have, but his counterpart in Scotland doesn't, and would rather stand with the Tories in that regard. And if he wants to respect Holyrood, he should ask, and he should work with the SNP about bringing more powers back to the Holyrood Parliament, including powers over energy, for example. They discussed and debated in the Parliament a few months ago. Respect the 2021 result, but respect the call for more powers to come back and make the Parliament more powerful. So it's incredible arrogance. And if you look at how they then, after the council elections, said they wouldn't go into any coalitions or partnerships and then jump into bed with Tories all over Scotland, then it almost makes Anas Sarwar's position laughable. It's utterly laughable that he thinks anybody would think that he supports the right of Scotland to have that sovereign right. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
As you say, Paul, he looks very much to be shoulder to shoulder with the Tories. But to the point you were making there, this document appears to lean very heavily on a report that was commissioned by the Labour presiding officer, Ken McIntosh, back in 2017. And one of the things it talks about is strengthening committees' ability to compel witnesses to appear. Now, to the point you made, like Westminster ministers who routinely, point blank, refuse to appear before committees at Holyrood. Although, as we know now with regard to Priti Patel and Dominic Raab, they're now into the habit of also refusing to appear before House of Commons select committees as well. So do you think, is this document broadly, is it a rehash of old, out-of-date Labour thinking from 2017?
I think if the document itself came forward and it was presenting itself on the back of a Labour party that respected the right of 2021 and respected the right to have more powers, then it might have more credibility. But to then turn around and say that the sovereign right of people of Scotland is paramount, it just doesn't add up. I think a parliament should also, the parliament's now been there 20 odd years, to review what's there in terms of the powers of the committees, in terms of how effective the parliament is. I think it's healthy that every I suppose every parliamentary term that should be looked at. And I think the best way to approach that, there are various mechanisms within the parliament, whether it's through the parliamentary bureau or the various conveners that are in the committee. Then there's a way to discuss that. But for Anas Sarwar to come out and it's trying to get, he's almost looking for a little bit of political traction in terms of that. It just doesn't add up. He claims to be, strengthening Holyrood. He can't do that when he disrespects the right of the result in 2021. It makes his position laughable, as I said. totally incredulous in terms of that. Should we be looking at the powers of the committees and looking at? Of course, we should review these and have a look at that, but that should be done in a cross-party approach through the various parliamentary systems that are in place already to look at that. That's healthy. That's a healthy democracy. But Anas Sarwar can't come out and say that when he's disregarding the right, and it's not disregarding the SNP. It's disregarding the electorate that voted in a pro-independence majority of Parliament, and that will come back and backfire on them politically. I have no doubt about that.
As you say, Paul, disregarding the electorate, it's never a good look. Let's move on now, because the estimated cost to companies of decommissioning oil and gas infrastructure in the North Sea has fallen close to a target of nearly £40 billion. Production in the North Sea basin started in the 1960s, making it a petri dish for other fossil fuel extracting regions trying to bring down the cost of dismantling wells, platforms, pipelines, and other oil and gas infrastructure assets. While companies are the first in line to pay, taxpayers can be asked to foot the bill if they do not have the money. Tax incentives for decommissioning also affects public finances. The North Sea Transition Authority, the UK government regulator, said in a report published today that it estimates a total bill for decommissioning of around £44.5 billion. This compares with an estimate of around £60 billion made in 2017 and the sector's target of reducing the cost to £39 billion, which was penciled in for the end of 2022. A large chunk of costs have been saved by infrastructure owners clubbing together to plan big campaigns for decommissioning wells, the biggest cost factor, rather than on a project-by-project basis, the NSTA has said. Another approach is to reuse old oil fields and pipelines offshore for storing carbon siphoned off industrial processes. The proportion of decommissioning spending compared with operating spending in oil and gas fields in the UK North Sea is expected to rise from just over a fifth over the next 10 years to almost half over the next 30 to 40 years, the NSTA said. So, Paul, firstly, that point that I made at the end there, the spending increasing to almost half of the operating spending over the next 30 to 40 years, that sounds to me like it's going to take as long to decommission the North Sea sector as it did to commission and operate it. Do we not need to move much faster on this?
Yeah, I think it done, and I know this has been discussed in the Parliament. It does need to move quicker. We've known we need to move towards net zero in terms of that. We often, we've heard the debate in the Parliament. This was brought forward by the Tories at the time, saying the costs of decommissioning. Obviously, we've heard now it's about £45 billion. And it said that's been paid by the companies. Yeah, it's been paid by the companies, but that's factored into the bills that they then, into the bills that we receive at the end of it. So there is, we pay for that. We pay for that decommissioning in terms of that. So yes, it does need to move quicker. I know there are discussions, as you indicate, going on and around about carbon capture, and that needs to be, looked at as best we possibly can. But the decommissioning does need to happen a lot quicker than that. And of course, there is that managed transition from people who are in the oil and gas sector who will then move into the renewable sector. But there needs to be a clear linkage between what's happening in oil and gas and what's happening between the renewable sector, because there are transferable skills in terms of that. But the 45 billion that's been indicated is we're all paying for that. That's it. May be the companies that front that and pay that up front. These bills, that's then accounting for the bills that we receive later on, or the cost of oil, or whatever. It comes through. We pay for that directly. So there is that. So let's not forget that. That doesn't come out their their profit line, if you like. That we pay for that.
Absolutely, Paul. And Justin, also, I was going to ask you, the NSTA seems to be talking in its statement today about commercial innovation and project management innovation and saving costs. Shouldn't there be much more significant technical innovation too? We saw huge technical innovation when commissioning this infrastructure. Should we not be pushing the engineering harder as well?
Yeah, I think there should be more pressure for UK government on this one. Obviously, that's who holds the powers, but there should have been more. That we've known about this for a long number of years. So in terms of technology that's out there, we should have been looking at that. That should have been discussed. I think it's kind of almost been forgotten about, and there is almost, I think, that the element within the UK government, I suppose within the UK government, that doesn't want to put any pressure on the oil and gas sector in terms of that. It does need to move quicker. We do need that managed transition, but it does need to be moved quicker, and we should have been looking at more innovative ways to tackle this in a much quicker way. And this should have been planned 10, 15 years ago. It's now just been looked at now, which is is a bit late.
Absolutely, Paul. More than a bit late. But let's move on now, and we'll look at some more international news, because Taiwan's military has said it is preparing for war without seeking war after China's military began an unprecedented 4 days of live firing exercises close to Taiwan's shores, in reaction to Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island. At midday local time today, the Chinese state broadcaster CCTV announced the beginning of an important military exercise and organised live fire, expected to include missile tests. China, of course, sees Taiwan as part of its own territory. The People's Liberation Army Eastern Theatre Command announced it had conducted long-range live fire shooting training in the Taiwan Straits, including precision strikes on specific areas in the eastern part. It said expected results had been achieved, but didn't explain what that meant. Taiwan's defense ministry said the PLA had launched a number of Dongfeng series ballistic missiles into the waters northeast and southwest of Taiwan's main island. Taiwan's foreign ministry said it strongly condemns Beijing for following the example of North Korea in willfully test firing missiles into waters near other countries. Taipei also called on the international community to condemn China's military coercion. Notices of the exercises identified 6 areas encircling Taiwan, with warnings for all ships and aircraft to not enter the relevant sea areas and airspace. Some of the zones overlap with Taiwan's territorial waters and are near key shipping ports. Taiwan's defense ministry has accused China of in effect mounting a blockade with the actions. Flights and ships were still able to arrive in Taiwan, but had reportedly been advised to find alternate routes. 10 minutes before the drills began, Taiwan's Department of Defense issued a statement accusing the Chinese government of irrational behavior with its live fire exercises, saying they had the intention of changing the status quo and disrupting regional peace and stability. The US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi arrived in Taipei on Tuesday under intense global scrutiny. She met Taiwan's President, Tsai Ing-wen, as well as other political and business leaders and dissidents. She said US solidarity with Taiwan was crucial in facing an increasingly authoritarian China. So, Paul, without being glib about this, we already have an active war on mainland Europe. And are these developments, are these signs that China is anxious not to be left out of the league table of dictatorships destabilizing the planet?
Uh, I think it's deeply worrying. First of all, I think it's indicative of, I suppose, rising tensions between the US and China over a number of years, both whether it's in terms of trade, China's influence, and I suppose, and particularly in Africa, for example, around about lending monies to countries and their continuing influence on that. I think obviously China for a long period of time has looked at Taipei and said, it still sees them as part of China, and it will get it back one way or another. I know most commentators wouldn't expect any military intervention at this stage, but many of them said that the same thing about Ukraine, and we know what happened there. China, I think, has strengthened, I feel like, or whatever you want to look at its foreign policy and towards Taipei. So at the moment, I think it's a dangerous period for 4 or 5 days when they've got these military exercises going on. All we need is one missile that might, could be slightly off course, and it hits at Taiwan, for example. So it's deeply worrying. I think Nancy Pelosi's visit obviously was not an official visit; it wasn't backed by Joe Biden, but there is still moves, I think, within I suppose in the US around about trying to give more money to Taiwan and so on. I know there's just the various debates and discussions going on about that at the moment, so it's a dangerous situation. Let's see where it plays out, and hopefully not the same situation as Ukraine. We can't have another situation like this. In terms of how dangerous the world would be, but also in terms of the economic cost. We can't have that.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Paul. I was also going to ask you about the economic effects on everyone. We know that we've just been talking about we've been talking for weeks about the huge economic effects on everyone as a result of the war in Ukraine. Now, military activity, let alone a blockade, is going to threaten the supply of microchips for the planet. More or
Yeah,
less, every single microchip now is manufactured in Taiwan. So,
yeah.
do you think should the UK government be starting to think about taking steps, or should the Scottish government be thinking about promoting and supporting efforts to restart chip manufacturing here?
I think any responsible government should be looking at that and obviously looking at what the potential impact of that is. I think at the moment what we need is clear heads. I think the last thing we need is belligerent China and a belligerent US try to raise tensions. I don't think there's any winners in that at all, and I think that should be recognised. So I think the key things are to avoid any immediate issues in the next 4 or 5 days, but we should be looking to bring tensions down. They've been rising for a period of time. Um, as you said, if they're starting to impact on the production of microchips, I guess that's going to have a major impact on the world economy when it really doesn't need it at this particular time. We need calm minds, we need calm heads in terms of that. Let's go through the next 3 or 4 days, but there needs to be a move away from the rise in tensions between China and US because there's no positive outcome from it at all.
Well, that's a very good point that you make, Paul, and certainly in the context of the US's response and the US's part in to play in this as it unfolds. I was struck that there was quite a lot of mention today of Japan in the reporting of events that are surrounding Taiwan. Now, the US has no formal obligation to defend Taiwan, but is signalling you might think that it is certainly it regards itself as having some responsibility there. But in the context of Japan, the US has written international obligations to defend Japan. So in the context of both of Chinese expansionism towards both Taiwan and China, towards Taiwan and Japan, should we be concerned about America's role in responding to that?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, whatever way we want to look at, whether it's a Republican government or Democratic government, US foreign policy it has always been hawkish in terms of what it is, and it's not something I've supported over a long period of time. It is a hawkish defence policy, whether we like it or not, whether it's Republican or Democrat. Um, they pretend to be, or they propose to be, the defender of free speech. You could argue within America, it's free speech being defended within their own borders and so on. So, yeah, I think that economic interests drive this, very much drive this, in terms of what the economic interests are in Japan and Taiwan. That shouldn't be the overarching policy driver, if you like, and what happens in terms of defence policy. But they're very much, and I think China looks almost the same in terms of that. It's protecting their economic interests. This is what a lot of it comes down to. It's not just the geopolitical and the defence implications. This is down to around, I think, around about economic interests. Whether it's in the Pacific Basin or whether it's in other parts of the world, a lot of it is driven by economic interests, and that's where I think the US see China as a major threat in that regard. So, there needs to be discussions around about that, and much broader discussions around about where they can work together if they possibly can in terms of that. But this is driven a lot of it by, as I said, by economic interest.
As you say, Paul, as often it may well be a case of following the money in this situation
Yeah.
and seeing where it leads. Now, looking at the time, I think we should move on to our final item this afternoon, and that's because almost 800,000 UK households cancelled their subscriptions to Netflix or Amazon Prime Video between April and June, as the cost of living crisis forces customers to cut back on the number of services they pay for. The number of homes with access to at least one subscription video on demand (SVOD) service fell from 19.57 million in the first quarter to 19.19 million at the end of the second, a net decrease of 382,000, according to the latest survey by the Broadcast Audience Research Board, also known as BARB. The UK survey figures follow Figures follow two quarterly reports of subscriber losses from Netflix, which has had tens of billions wiped off its market value after losing 1.5 million customers so far this year worldwide, the first drop in sign-ups in a decade for what is the UK's most popular paid-for streaming service. Between April and June, 206,000 households dropped the subscription to Netflix, which has put its subscription price up twice in the past 2 years, taking the streamer's UK customer base down to 17.08 million. Amazon's Prime Video, which is increasing its price for UK customers from $7.99 to $8.99 a month from September, reported the steepest decrease among the most popular SVOD services in the UK. The number of UK homes with access to Prime Video, which is accessible as part of Amazon Prime's subscription service, fell by 589,000 quarter on quarter from 13.35 to 12.76 million. And Sky's Now TV dropped from 43,000 homes, taking its subscriber base to just over 2 million households at the end of the second quarter. Now, Paul, firstly, in April, research from Kantar showed that the number of UK homes that had at least one paid-for streaming service had fallen by 215,000 in the first quarter, marking the end of a decade of almost uninterrupted growth. Do you think are things changing now? Are subscription services past their peak, or is it the economic reality that people are already cutting costs as the cost of living crisis starts to bite?
I think it's a bit of both. I think when you've seen discussions going on, whether it's Netflix or Amazon, I think there was discussions around about these going back probably about a year, 18 months, where they were starting to highlight and not so much give profit warnings, but give warnings around about where they've seen their subscribers, where that was going. So I think that was starting then. Is there saturation in the market? Not sure if that's the case, but there are still a lot of players in that regard. And if you're adding, for people who want to watch football, for example, whether it's BT Sport or looking at Sky Sports, or you look at Netflix and Amazon, you could quite simply, if you were a member of 3 or 4 of these, you could quite easily be paying £40-50 a month for that in terms of that. And I think there was that drop before it. I think the cost of living crisis has accelerated that and will continue to accelerate that. If we're talking around about 10, subscribing to Netflix and Amazon is going to cost you £20 a month, roughly. So, £20 a month is a lot of money to a lot of people at this particular point. So I'm not surprised, and I think you'll continue to see these drop, and I think probably drop quicker than they are just now. So if you're talking about 215,000, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these figures £1 million over a year, which again is a sizable, considerable hit to the companies that are there. So yeah, I'd expect it to continue, and I think they expect it to continue as well. And I think the markets expect this to happen, whether it's through Netflix or Amazon or other subscription channels.
Absolutely, Paul. And thinking about TV subscriptions or SVOD subscriptions more generally, we know that the Johnson government was threatening to privatise Channel 4, which you think might have gone to a subscription service perhaps. And of course, they have been threatening to completely change the way in which the BBC is financed. So do you think that the contraction in the number of subscribers for the existing providers, do you think that might have an impact on a Tory government's plans to flog Channel 4 and throttle the BBC?
I would like to think it would. In terms of the wider context, as you said, talking about Channel 4 and what their plans are for the BBC licence fee, I don't think it will. And again, it comes back, I think it'll be driven by ideology, that they think the market's best and let the markets decide, and it'll find its place in terms of that. So there has to be that balance between public service broadcasting and obviously, fee paying or subscription broadcasting. I don't think the Tories see that. I don't think they would care around about after that balance was lost between Channel 4, BBC and other subscriptions. So I would like to think, based on where they are, they would at least put a pause in it. I would very much have my doubts about what would happen. The only positive thing is that I suppose Nadine Dorris may or may not be involved in that now. I think her understanding of the complexities around about broadcasting, particularly about Channel 4, again, was totally, a lack of understanding was clear to see. So hopefully she may or may not be involved in that, depending on what happens in a Liz Truss government, I would imagine. So who knows? But ideology, again, I think will drive this one forward.
I think you're right, Paul, and of course, subscription to media services is important for Broadcasting Scotland because we are
Yeah,
supported by subscriptions and donations in order to keep the lights on, and keeping the lights on is getting much more expensive as we've been discussing this evening. But that, I'm afraid, is all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies, as I say, on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. And as I say, our need for your financial support is increasing because of the increasing costs of running the station. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, I'll be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. So a very special thanks to our very special guest, Paul McLennan MSP. Paul, thanks very much.
thanks, Andrew. It's a pleasure as always.
Well, thank you for giving us your time and your thoughts this evening, Paul. Today marks the anniversary of the birth in Portobello in 1870 of Sir Harry Lauder, the highly successful Scottish singer and entertainer who toured the world for more than 40 years. I'd like to thank everyone for keeping right on to the end of the road with us on Broadcasting Scotland. Please don't go roaming and the gloaming, but please do have a very peaceful evening and join us again here very soon. Bye bye.